there's something that my dad taught me when I was 5 years old, and it's a lesson that I've never forgotten. And he taught me that you can never make up enough time in the first half for what you'll lose in the second half if you've gone too fast. I'm Lindsay Parry from CoachParry.com, where we help you to become fitter, faster, and stronger. Today we're going to talk about executing the perfect race strategy.
One of the key things that I really believe in terms of getting your race down to a T is your pre-race strategy. I'd really recommend that you get into a nice routine of what you like to do before a race. That can be all the way up into race week. So making sure that you're getting good sleep and so on is important. But coming up to the day before a race, what are the things that you usually do? I like to personally have the same meal the night before I have a race, and that's really key, because you don't want to be trying too many new things the night before a race and then you struggle on race day. You want to stay away from foods that are too creamy or rich. And so I like to stick to the same meal the night before. I know what works for me, and that's quite a key thing to do. I think another aspect is just you don't want to be rushing on race morning. The races it's enough of a race getting to the start line, getting into the pin, and so ensuring that you're not having to do things on the morning. So set out your race kit the night before, ensure that your shoes are ready and good to go, the right pair of socks, everything that you want to have there for your race day, set out the night before. Make sure your numbers pinned on the night before, so you're not running around looking for pins. So just make sure you get into a nice routine the day before. Have your stuff set out, and you want to know that you're getting into bed early, so don't rush around stressing about things. Realize or think about the things that you want to have done and ensure that you do those the night before. Get into bed early and try and sleep. I know those aren't always possible before big races, and so try and just really get some good rest the night before. Race morning, exactly the same thing. Try and get into a routine. Obviously, there haven't been races for a long time, and so it's been a while since we've raced. I've experienced that recently, and my whole routine was out the window. And so just try to remember the things that you want to do in the morning of your race. So getting up in enough time, preparing your breakfast with enough time to go, so that you're not rushing around and worried that you're going to miss the start.
So Sean has discussed how pre-race preparations can help with that race day strategy. Another thing you can do pre-race is also just doing a route recce. So knowing what you are in for on race day. That could be getting on a bicycle and cycling the route if you have the availability or the access to do that, jumping in your car and driving the route. It helps to know and not be surprised by what you are going to meet on race day. That could mean just knowing where the hills are, so where you might have to implement your walk strategies on race day. Knowing where the aid stations are, water points are, so you can help with getting your nutritional strategy on race day right. What you should be carrying, how much you should be taking in between each of those water points. Another big one with the race recce is also knowing what the race organizers will be supplying at those water points. So what kind of drinks, will there be food on offer? All that helps with those nutritional strategies for your planning. And then, as I mentioned, just knowing the route, and you don't want to arrive on race day and suddenly go, hang on, I wasn't sure about that. I can't believe there's this huge climb that I didn't know about. So just planning, knowing the route, having an idea of what you are going to be faced with when you get to the start line helps a lot in putting your mind at ease, so that you can start to worry about your actual strategy and not have to still think about what's coming up the road ahead.
One of the first things we need to look at is what is the distance of the race that you are training for. Is there a difference between how we approach a race depending on whether it's a 3 mile, 5 kilometer or marathon or moving into the ultra? And the answer to that question is yes, but the differences are subtle. Because you've got much larger margins for error in a 5 to 10k race, and then those margins for error become much smaller as we move to the half and then into the marathon, and then those margins for error become tiny when we move into the ultra marathon. That spread of margin for error, and what do I mean by margin for error? Well, if you make a mistake with a pacing strategy in a 5 or a 10, you may lose a little bit of time, but you're not going to bleed minutes. So essentially, on the shorter distances, making pacing mistakes is more forgiving. Once you get to half marathon, by the time you maybe realize you haven't got your pacing strategy spot on, you're still close enough to the finish to maybe hang in there, but that's where you really start to bleed out on time. As we get to the marathon, that's where things really start to become real. Because generally speaking, if we get the pacing wrong, it's not in the final quarter even that we realize that out. It's generally around mile 14, 15, kilometer 25. And that is still a long way out to just suck it up and hang in there, and then you start to see your goal time really slip away from you. And of course, in ultras, that starts to balloon because you get to a point where you're doing much more walking than running, and you can lose hours sometimes on an ultra if you don't get your pacing right. There's a constant debate about whether people should be doing positive or negative splits, and a slight difference in definition for some people at what those two terms mean. So at coachparry.com, a negative split means that you have run faster in the second half than you have in the first half. And a positive split therefore means that you've run slower in the second half than you have in the first half. Now, personally, the perfect race strategy is one where you run pretty damn close to even splits in a race. But that's very difficult for most people to achieve, and a lot of people can't feel the right level of effort or pace to get them to that even pacing strategy. And therefore, when they set out a race plan, it's really important to be a little bit on the conservative side. There's something that my dad taught me when I was 5 years old, and it's a lesson that I've never forgotten. And he taught me that you can never make up enough time in the first half for what you'll lose in the second half if you've gone too fast. And very simply, all that means is that the more time you try to shovel in the bag as a buffer in the first half, the worse the second half's going to be, and you'll almost always lose all that time and some more. If you go on a more conservative race strategy, often we fall just slightly short of what our goal time was, but we come through really strong and have a much more positive race experience. So of the two race strategies, you're going to come much closer to your goal time if you're a little bit conservative and a little bit too slow through the first half, and then are chasing hard to make up, because psychologically you're going to be feeling much stronger. You're going to feel like you can chase. You're going to be passing people, and that's psychologically a really great feeling when people are just constantly coming back to you. And as I said just now, you get through that finish line feeling really, really great.
A key aspect of ensuring that you have the perfect race day comes down to your fueling. This ties into what you do before your race. So as I mentioned earlier, ensuring your night before, your breakfast before is up to scratch and what you're used to. Nothing new on race day. But then for your actual race, you really want to ensure that you prepare and plan your nutrition for that race. Firstly, and we see this often, is that people don't eat during their races, or ensure that they have enough nutrition during their races. And if you're out there in a marathon for 5 hours, you really have to ensure that you are getting the energy that you need to sustain you for that amount of time. It's really, really vital that you have a strategy for your nutrition. The key thing here, though, is that you don't want to try that for the first time on your race. You want to practice that in your long runs leading up to the race for a couple of reasons. Obvious one being that you want to know that how your nutrition affects you during those long runs, and so that you can make any changes before the race.
Then we need to unpack pace versus effort when determining or working out how you're going to execute your perfect race. Now, ideally, you want to be able to feel the right effort for the distance that you're running. That takes both experience and an innate ability to really have a good idea of how long you will be able to maintain a specific pace for. And having run for 40 years, I can tell you that that's the one talent, let's call it, that very few runners possess. That is why we set out so many race plans according to pace. Because if we know a runner's ability over a few distances, or any distance to be honest, if we know a runner's gotten quite close to their best ability on a 5 or a 10 or a 21, and they're training for a marathon, we can use those times, provided the training has been appropriate, to get a very good idea of what they should be targeting for the marathon. And then based on that, we can set out a race plan for them that says, right, through these sections, these are the paces that you need to run. And as a runner, what you constantly want to be doing every time you race is really taking in and on board how you feel when somebody sets you out at that specific pace, because if you can learn that ability, it really sets you up for being way more successful across a range of distances. Where it gets a little bit complicated is, as Dev pointed out earlier, you've done your route recce and you are running a race with very variable terrain. Then we need to take into account where the race is hardest and where it is easiest. So I've spoken a lot about how the best strategy is to go through halfway more conservatively and then to run essentially quicker in the second half. Now, while that is still true of the effort, it can't be true of the pacing if we are running a race that has 3 or 4 hills in the second half and the first half is very flat. So it's important when working out where you're going to put in effort, what the paces should be, that we are taking into account the gradients that you're going to run. And one of the big mistakes that people make early in their running, when they don't quite understand the relationship between pace and effort, is that when you tell them to run at an average pace, they try to maintain that whether they're going uphill on the flat or downhill. And that really is a recipe for you having an awful race. So we have to give some allowance for slowing down when we going uphill. It's a very rough rule of thumb, and it's quite rough because some people are much better suited to running uphill than others and struggle much less when going uphill. But a guide to give you some idea of how you'd make an adjustment on that pace is that essentially you want to give 10 to 15 seconds per kilometer for every percent of gradient that you are running up, and that's about 15 to 20 seconds per mile per percent of gradient that you're going up. And then you need to take into account how long the hill is. And so if you're running very long hills, you'll probably compensate even further by taking a few strategic walk breaks as you go up that hill. But I think the key message here is that you have to make allowance for, plan for, and execute differently when you are running on a hilly race than you do on a flat race. I've spent most of the video unpacking around pace and touched a little bit on effort, but there are of course other ways of tracking your efforts on race day and calculating what the right effort for you is. We've got power, we've got pace, we've got heart rate. And really what I want to just do quickly is give you a little bit of a difference between the three to help you make decisions when you are going into race day, what you are going to use to measure those efforts. So the nice thing about power is that it is unique to you as an individual. It's something that is calculated over time. You input your own body mass, you wear the foot pod, and it takes into account the vertical ascent meters, and that is the critical part of what I want to talk about. Because of that, because it's a calculation that takes into account your body mass, the speed that you are traveling at, and the change in vertical ascent, you get almost instant real-time feedback about what power you are running right now. You can then aim to keep a very consistent power on the flats, on the ups, and on the downs. You will have to slow down on the ups to keep your power at the same number when you're running on the flats, and you're going to have to speed up on the downs to have your average power the same as it is on the flats. You do, again, same as everything, you do need to have a little bit of experience and have used the power meter a fair amount in training to get that balance quite right, because what will happen, particularly on race day, is that you will overpower ever so slightly on the ups, and as long as that is within a 5 to 10% range, you're probably going to get away with it. But by the same token, on the down slope, if you really try to match the power on the down to what you have set out as your average power, and that you will hold quite comfortably on the flats, then you can completely shred your quads. So you'll probably overpower ever so slightly on the ups, you'll underpower ever so slightly on the downs, and on the flats, the idea is to then really drive it home on your average power. Pace we've unpacked enough, and again, it's just about having that awareness and knowing that you have to back off on pace when you're going uphill and downhill. And heart rate's a pretty good metric to use because it's an actual reflection of what's happening inside you. So it's a real, true reflection of the effort that you are running at. The complication that comes in with heart rate is that it can be a little bit difficult to calculate the right heart rate per distance, so 5, 10, 21 and longer. So it's a little bit complicated trying to figure out exactly what that sustainable heart rate number is for you as an athlete. And it's further complicated by the fact that as soon as you are doing exercise that is lasting for an hour and longer, and in particular 2, 3, 4 hours and longer, because as you run, you sweat. And that water has to come from somewhere, and some of it comes from your blood volume, and so your blood volume decreases. Therefore, your heart rate has to go up to get enough blood around the body to keep providing oxygen, energy, and removing energy metabolite. And so we get something called cardiac drift, and that cardiac drift has got no reflection on the intensity that you're running at. And so as your heart rate goes up, you can make the mistake then of running too easy because you're trying to pull your heart rate down. But it really is a great reflection, particularly in the first hour, to set the tone for the right effort for you to be able to hold. And then again, complications always come in when we run up hills, and it's just important to know that when you are using heart rate, that there's generally a 45-second to a minute delay in what's happening inside versus reflecting in the heart rate. And so when you do get to hills, you have to proactively slow down, because by the time your heart rate now goes too high, you're a minute into the hill and have already done too much work.
I really hope you got some good value out of this video. Please hit the like and subscribe button. We really hope you do have an absolutely fantastic race. And if you do need assistance in prepping for your next race or next big goal coming up, check out the video on screen now where we can help you with some of those training strategies going forward.